This series of the 2025 50 Faces podcast is supported by Eagle Point Credit Management. Eagle Point Credit Management is a specialist investment manager principally focused on income-oriented credit investments in niche and inefficient markets. Currently, they believe that Eagle Point is the largest investor in CLO equity in the world and one of the largest non-bank lenders focusing on providing financing solutions to credit funds. Eagle Point Credit Management currently has $12 billion in assets under management. This series is supported by Benefit Street Partners. Benefit Street Partners is a leading global alternative credit asset manager offering clients investment solutions across a broad range of complementary credit strategies, including direct lending, special situations, structured credit, high-yield bonds, leveraged loans, and commercial real estate debt and equity. As of December 31st, 2024, BSP Alcentra had $77 billion of assets under management.
When you lose, it's generally pretty humiliating and pretty painful. I mean, you'll be on the bottom, somebody will be on top of you sweating and squishing you, and eventually to the point where, you'll have to submit. You'll tap out and, you'll start again. It's perfectly safe, but humiliating. So I feel like if you can deal with that kind of adversity on a day-to-day basis, then stuff you do in the business place isn't that hard. Think of it that way. It's just learning to embrace the discomfort is a great way to give you perspective and teaches you through that ultimate laboratory of trial and error, teaches you how to come up with what will work. And it's no different formula in the workplace.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Rich Byrne, who is President and CEO of Benefit Street Partners. Prior to joining Benefit Street Partners in 2013, he was the CEO of Deutsche Bank Securities Inc. and the co-head of Global Capital Markets at Deutsche Bank. He's a board member of Wynn Resorts Limited and New York Roadrunners, and the founder and CEO of Kasai Elite Grappling Championships, a premier martial arts organization where he practices at a competitive level. Welcome, Rich. Thanks for joining me today.
Ethan, nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, I've already had the benefit of listening to a number of other podcasts that you participated in, and I will link to those in the show notes. So we're going to try to go in a slightly different direction here. But before we get into your current positioning and what your passions are, it would be great if you could just briefly cycle through your background, starting with where you grew up and how you entered the world of finance.
Wow. Okay. Be happy to. So I grew up in New York, in Queens, actually, is where I was born. I grew up most of my formative years in Long Island, went to state school at State University of New York at Binghamton, was a fine arts major, but found my way to the world of finance first through business school. And did a lot of interviewing. I thought I was going to be an advertising executive, connecting fine arts. And one day looked on the board of starting salaries and was appalled to see that the investment banking starting salaries were considerably higher than those in advertising. So I interviewed for both. And as it turned out, my first job was a summer intern at what was then Manufacturers Hanover Trust. Was bought by Chase, was bought by JP Morgan. So, JP Morgan today. Then got my first job on Wall Street at Merrill Lynch in Chicago. I went to business school at Kellogg, Northwestern in Chicago. And just to bring the story current, after working in equities in Chicago as an equity sales trader, moved to New York to be one of the founding members of Merrill Lynch's high yield research department. So got into the leveraged finance business that way. Worked my way up over the years, co-headed global leverage finance at Merrill Lynch, took on a similar role at Deutsche Bank, where I worked for 14 years as well. I worked at Merrill Lynch for 14 years, Deutsche Bank for 14 years. When I left Deutsche Bank, as you heard from my title, I was the CEO of Deutsche Bank Securities, which is a U.S. broker-dealer, but also co-ran global capital markets. And then 12 years ago, joined Benefit Street Partners. So hopefully I don't have a 14-year time limit. Hopefully I can last a little longer than that, but been here for, as I said, 12 years and seen our AUM grow quite considerably. I think we're about 76 billion of AUM. We sold our firm to Franklin Templeton. which is $1.5 trillion of AUM. So we've got big aspirations to go.
What I'm always fascinated by is whether a background in fine arts or art history or other disciplines that have perspective and lots of different cultural aspects. And does that affect how you think in the world of finance? Did that have any effect on your mindset or approach?
It might, Ethan, but I'll tell you something. I mean, I must have interviewed by now thousands of candidates for different jobs over the years. And the first thing I do is look down the resume to look at their interests or their major or, something outside of the world of finance. I think the first way I would answer your question is I think it's great when people have varied interests. It's just not that interesting to see somebody who was a business undergraduate and business school graduate major and then went into investment banking and sometimes become somewhat one-dimensional. So the ability, and remember, everything we do in probably in the entire work world, but certainly in the Wall Street workspace, is there's a sales component. You're interacting with other people, whether they're clients or your internal constituents. And I just think it makes you more relatable, more human, more interesting to have varied interests. It doesn't have to be art. I mean, it could be anything. Does it give you a different way of thinking? Maybe. I was not an art history major. I was an art studio major. So, there's hopefully a creative element there. I don't know the formula yet. We've tried to find ways to enhance the creativity around the workplace because at the end of the day, thinking outside the box is incredibly valuable. So yeah, of course, having people with outside interests and outside experiences and different perspectives, and you put them in a room, generally come up with more out of the box, more creative thinking. So I think in all those cases, it's a good thing to have people with varied interests.
And one area I see a lot of varied interest in our field is sport, and jiu-jitsu, in your case, is a huge area of focus and passion. And I'd love to ask, before we go into some of the lessons from that, how you first discovered it and what motivated you to take it to this level.
Yeah, so I've been doing jiu-jitsu now for almost 20 years. And I found it quite accidentally through a business connection, actually. I was always very interested in sports, and I was a runner. I ran a bunch of marathons. I've run in, throughout school. And I got hurt. I had a labral tear in my hip, and my doctor told me I'll live a perfectly healthy life. I just have to stop running, which he might as well have told me I had to put a stake in my heart. It was it was really painful to hear. So when one door closes, maybe sometimes another one opens. And it was through a client, the Fertitta brothers, Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta, who owned a company called Station Casinos. We were very, very active in the day, given my background in casinos. I was a research analyst in doing a lot of underwriting, and we were working on their LBO. And they had just bought, small world, the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championships, which I had never heard of. This was a lot of 20 plus years ago. And they set me up for a lesson with one of the premier people in the world, Renzo Gracie, whose great-grandfather was the founder of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. So I was in the deep water pretty quickly. But through that introduction, it gave me exposure. And 20 years later, still haven't lost my interest. It's still an incredible passion.
I think in keeping with many martial arts, there's a huge psychological component, not just the physical component of that. And in researching this, I found some fascinating lessons in the doctrine or philosophy around jiu-jitsu, which I thought might apply quite interestingly to our professional world. So one of the first was there is no losing in jiu-jitsu. You either win or you learn. And I'd say, how does that apply to you, and whether through jiu-jitsu and your approach to life or taking that into the professional setting?
Yes. Well, for the record, winning is still better. But yes, the way I say it is, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And also, if you got frustrated from losing, if you're one of those people, boy, would you be living a miserable life, because the most successful people in the world, they fail far more often than they succeed. And, when do you learn the better lessons? Oftentimes it's, the failure that produces the best learning. So I don't think jiu-jitsu is unique in this regard. I think it applies to everything, and I think it's a very healthy mindset.
And the other quote I thought was fascinating was about jiu-jitsu being about revelation of character and potential. That essentially our potential maybe is within us, but it's a question of how we reveal it or what causes us to reveal it. Do you see that that is true in the professional setting?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the great things about jiu-jitsu is think of it this way. You live life through experiential. You can do a lot of textbook learning, you can do a lot of reading, but at the end of the day, you have to go out and try it. And the way jiu-jitsu works is we'll typically, if you'll go to a class or a session like I do, you'll do the first half. If it's an hour and a half, you'll do the first 40, 45 minutes of learning techniques. And then you'll do the next 45 minutes of sparring with people, real life. You can try out what you just learned or what you learned the day before, the week before, the month before on real people and see if it works. And that's a great way to learn. And through failure, it certainly teaches you, because I think in a martial art, when you lose, it's generally pretty humiliating and pretty painful. I mean, you'll be on the bottom, somebody will be on top of you sweating and squishing you, and eventually to the point where, you'll have to submit. You'll tap out and, you'll start again. It's perfectly safe, but humiliating. So I feel like if you can deal with that kind of adversity on a day-to-day basis, then stuff you do in the business place isn't that hard. Think of it that way. It's just learning to embrace the discomfort is a great way to give you perspective, and teaches you through that ultimate laboratory of trial and error, teaches you how to come up with what will work. And it's no different formula in the workplace. Exactly the same.
It's really interesting because you speak about learning. And I suppose one of the things that clearly, how would you say in terms of the spectrum of what you have to learn in jiu-jitsu, are you always learning? Because in the workplace, there's a certain level people may think they've nothing left to learn, or there's a kind of a finite amount of skills they might need.
No, it never ends. I mean, there's very few vocations you can take up where you could actually get to the end and say, I am now the ultimate master and I've achieved perfection in every single aspect. I mean, maybe that's not achievable in any field. Certainly in jiu-jitsu, that seems like conquering the impossible. I mean, there are literally thousands and thousands of techniques and moves and counters and different things you can do. I think of it as sort of sports chess, because, there's as many combinations as there might be on a chessboard. The difference in jiu-jitsu is you don't have to wait patiently for the other person to go. You could go 3 moves before they do any moves. And just think of how many combinations there are. And then, of course, there's a strength and speed and agility. There's the physical component. So it's very challenging. It's very challenging on the mind. It's very challenging physically. So, yeah, it's a dynamic sport, which there's no ever getting to the end. In fact, the ideal that I learned on the first day that I showed up, I asked my instructor, what's the object? I understand the object is to win, in the match, but over the course of learning about this sport, what's the object? What are you trying to achieve? And he told me, which I've never forgotten, it's effortless control of your opponent, and then leading to a submission or, ending the match. So in other words, at no point during the fight, during the match, are you ever not in control of your opponent. You have mastered the ability to control their body with your movements. That seems so appealing to me, maybe in a sadistic way, I don't know. But that seemed so exciting to me that 20 years later still is my main motivation for showing up every day. The thought that I could get there one day, which maybe I never will, or no human ever will, but I get a little closer every day.
And it's so interesting because of the frequent practices you attend and frequent sessions you attend. I think in life, I've heard people talk about going to the mental gym around, say, our intellectual capacity, say something like finance, and maybe writing a newsletter or doing a podcast is that. But there is the need to continuously go back and refresh a skill set. And equally, that ability to put into practice real time is something that maybe comes from having frequent coaching. But I think also this tapping out. The more you tap out, the easier it is to tap out. And I think tapping out without recrimination or shame and starting again, which again, that's sort of a muscle. It's something that we probably should apply in making mistakes or at least restarting.
In martial arts, ultimately, if you're competing, they raise one person's hand. They don't generally raise, there's a rare circumstance where it could happen, but there's one winner, there's one loser. I think one of the differences in the finance world is I think the best outcomes are where it isn't a zero-sum game, where you're trying to find the transactions that we generally, I think, have considered the most successful that across my career and our firm's successes and failures were ones where there was a win on both sides. And I think it's about intelligent negotiation, understanding best what's important to your counterparty and, finding a way for them to get that while you can still get what you want. And I think martial arts is like that in the gym. But ultimately, sometimes you're just out in the real world where they're only going to raise one person's hand. So I think there are differences. And I will tell you the point about ego. Yeah, I think the times that I can attribute our biggest failures are times when the ego got in the way, where there was a way to win and everybody to win, but that wasn't good enough. And what do they say on Wall Street? Bulls and bears make money, but pigs get slaughtered. I think there's an approach that, when you take ego away, is generally much more predictable and dependable, if that makes sense.
We're going to take a short break to hear from one of our sponsors of this series, Eagle Point Credit Management. I sat down with Tom Majewski, founder and managing partner of Eagle Point. I asked him one of the best ways to create value today.
One of the best ways to create value today, frankly, is taking a CLO that's probably halfway through its non-call period, maybe 2/3 of the way through. You can see 6 months out, you're going to be able to do a reset, maybe take a lot of costs out, maybe even take a dividend to the equity class. It takes a lot of work. It doesn't just happen automatically, but it's a way to create very real value today. And I think it's misappreciated in the market.
And now back to the show.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I suppose there has to be an element of ego to have that confidence and presence to enter the spar in the first place. But I suppose it's the negative aspect of exaggeration of that ego that is when we end up going to the slaughter. I'd love to tie this to some of maybe your leadership principles, just tying this back now to finance. I think we've had some really interesting parallels drawn here in jiu-jitsu. What would you say some of your leadership principles or style is?
For me, this is a great question because I addressed in my investment banking days and today, I always address the incoming class. I always volunteer, whether it's the incoming class of MBAs or BAs or just new hires, and just try to provide some advice and mentorship. My greatest advantage in life is that I've been alive for 63 years, and having failed and sometimes succeeded as often as I have, you tend to pick up a lot of life lessons. So with that, I think one of the biggest ones, my leadership advice, is to lead by example. Nobody wants to follow somebody that, the general that says, oh, go take the hill and I'll be back here, in my little hut. Good luck to you guys. You generally will give your all for that general that gets on their horse or whatever kind of battle you're in and rides up front, along with the rank and file troops. And I think the same applies in work. It's like you should have the same ethos, the same work ethic. And I always enjoy, like when it comes to the end of the year, when we have to pay people or recognize people, promotions or whatever it is, I always think that the day you're out of touch is when you need people coming in to make the case for the people for you to make the decision. Wouldn't it be so much better if you worked alongside all these people and you're able to build your own opinions? And I think they have a lot more respect for you. So from a leadership standpoint, I think that was your question. That is sort of the number one role model that I would follow. But maybe there was more to your question. So I'll turn it back to you.
No, I think that's great. I mean, I think in terms of that certainly squares with getting into the arena and being alongside and being engaged in that fray. Then just in terms of back to Benefit Street and your current opportunity set, you mentioned hoping not to trigger a 14-year expiry date now that you're there 12 years. How do you look at the opportunity set in what you do for the next, say, 5 years? What do you see that excites you?
So everything we do at Benefit Street is credit. And the subset of what we do is alternative credit, meaning hopefully your audience knows what alternatives are, but it's generally maybe more value add products that provide hopefully some more alpha. In our case, it's direct lending, it's commercial real estate lending, it's distressed or special situations lending. The one commonality for us is everything is lending, but it comes under a lot of umbrellas. I have said this probably have said this every year for almost all 40 years I've been doing this, is I see tremendous opportunity over the near and intermediate term. Maybe the best I've ever seen, although it was the best I've ever seen maybe every year for the last 40 years. But Wall Street is an incredible industry where you have a lot of smart people, but you're generally trying to innovate and come up with the next best thing. It involves paying attention. It involves being on the cutting edge. It involves being up on every little nuance. And thankfully, we have a lot of people here that are experts in their subfields that can collaborate to figure this stuff out. For us, I think it's continuing to grow our product suite. One of the big changes across alternatives has been the growth in asset raising in the private wealth channel or retail channel. A lot of these alternative products were originally adopted by the big institutions. And now we've come up with different wrappers that provide maybe a different liquidity, a different tax reporting for individuals. And being part of Franklin Templeton, we've been able to attach to that and raise capital. But whether it's growing same-store sales with just continuing the organic growth of our platform, growing through additional fundraising through the retail channel, or in my case, one important part of my job is growing through acquisition. We've made a number of acquisitions over the years, and I think having a balance of growing or running your business with organic growth and inorganic growth through acquisition would probably define every single successful Wall Street firm. And we've been students of who's done it well, who's not done it well. And they say sometimes the best way to learn is to make mistakes along the way, consistent with my comments earlier. I wouldn't mind having the success without the mistakes. So let's study other people who did make mistakes and make sure we don't make those.
And that's very interesting. So having a blended mix of perhaps through acquisition, maybe up and down the cap size spectrum. Do you see any particular areas of private credit being crowded today or less attractive because they've just evolved?
Yeah. So funny enough, before COVID, let's say between 5 and 10 years ago, I used to go to panels, be on a panel for credit or some sort. And I'd want to talk about private credit, which is something that we do, as I mentioned. And maybe on the 10th question, if there was even any minutes left in the time for the panel, they would reluctantly talk about private credit. Today, it's the only thing people want to talk about, which I think is funny. Things have gone full circle. So maybe that's the time you should think about skating to where the puck's going. I think private credit is still an attractive relative value, certainly is relative to the liquid markets. But for example, one thing that we've been focusing on is maybe the better relative value today is real estate credit, real estate lending. Why? Because the real estate market has gone through a lot of turmoil. The office sector has all but imploded, in many parts of the country. Interest rates having gone up has impacted negatively real estate values. There's a lot of carnage. And as a result, we love dislocation because often it creates the best opportunity. So private credit or direct lending, it's raising all this capital and things are relatively calm and relatively safe. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but if you're looking to create your alpha, your opportunity, maybe sometimes you want to look through places where a hurricane has just gone through, which seems like that's what happened in commercial real estate.
Definitely. And I think there is often a complexity premium in being able to kind of dig into some of these distressed or stressed situations.
Absolutely.
Well, we've dealt with a lot of kind of the reflection section in the body of this podcast. So we might do kind of a slightly upside down. So just in terms of any closing questions, I'm going to curtail the usual number of closing questions. I do want to ask you about culture, though, because we started this speaking about the benefits of having a varied experience. And I'd love to know now in your leadership role, how you view the role of culture at the firm in retaining and attracting the right talent.
Oh, well, the good thing about Benefit Street Partners is I'm from two giant firms. Back in the day, there wasn't a firm, I think, as big. I think Merrill Lynch, they used to call it Mother Merrill. That's how big it was, just a giant firm. And I also worked at Deutsche Bank, which obviously is a giant firm. And now, at Benefit Street Partners, we're barely 250 people. And that's still a size where you can have your fingers in all the pies and know all the people. I know the people less well, maybe, than when there was 100 people, but you can still know all the people. I think there'll be a point in our growth where that's going to be much more difficult to do. But while we're at this size, I think that culture is something that we can carefully curate to be a powerful weapon for us. I think it involves, and doing that is, just like I said, sort of leading by example. For example, I know a lot of firms, when you have a 1:00 conference call, maybe it'll start at 1:05, 1:07, 1:10. Our calls start on the time that they were scheduled. Easy piece of culture. I'm not saying this is defining us or anything, but when your senior leaders follow something, and if you dial in at 1:02, you're going to be 2 minutes late, and that will change behavior. And I think that example kind of pervades all aspects of what we do. We try to lead by example and create a culture of people working hard, taking pride in what they do, wanting to be innovators, and most of all, wanting to win, wanting to learn, wanting to win. And we don't work late for show. When we're here, and you don't get extra points for being here until 8, 9 p.m. at night. I'd far more value the person that left at 6, but, was incredibly productive and super collaborative during the time they were here. So that culture is super valuable to us. People call it, pardon my French, the no a-holes philosophy. I'm not good enough to interview people and know that they're not going to turn out to be a bad egg. And, one rotten egg spoils the whole bunch, as the old saying goes. So we try to either adapt the people to our culture, or maybe they won't survive. But we've had a great retention rate, and I think it's paying a lot of attention to, who you bring in.
And my last question, because you've filled us with a lot of wisdom from some of the teachers and some of the wisdom you've picked up along the way. If we were to sum it up maybe in one piece of advice that you would have for your younger self, could you give us anything there?
Yeah, I think I was lucky, and I just kind of did this anyway. But life is filled with opportunity. You need to go out there, and like they say, again, I'm being very corny today, but they say the biggest regrets are not the things you did and failed, they're the things you didn't do. I think it's about getting on a frequency. When you find something that interests you, just get into that frequency. And it's amazing when you're doing something you love and you dedicate yourself to it, you can achieve incredible things. And one of the cool things about, and I think that's true for your personal life, I picked the martial arts, I've, my family, there's a lot of things where I've gone all in. But in the work world, Wall Street is such a great place to have that philosophy, because there's so many different areas and opportunities with Wall Street on ways that you can do that. And if you just sit in your seat and learn, you'll start connecting the dots, and you'll find your spot, your niche, and you can get into that frequency and become the expert and really make a name for yourself if you can kind of just get into the rhythm of this discipline and what it does, because there's so many pathways that you could be like Lewis and Clark. You could be the first one out there to go create new products and do new things. And I'm not sure every field has that many portals where you can go to express yourself as Wall Street does. So I guess I would say just go in the directions that excite. I don't want to sound like a commencement speech, but it is go with your passion, go in the directions that your interests take you, work hard, study, and have confidence in yourself. Maybe the metaphor that worked well for me is a missile hits its target because the computer system in the missile is constantly steering it in the right direction. It's going to go too far left, and it steers it, and then it goes too far right, and eventually it will land on its target. Unless you're out in the real world, failing to the left, failing to the right, failing to the, how are you going to get there? So I think it's about just putting yourself out there, following what you want to do, learning. And I think the success will follow. And in my case, like I said before, the thing I would attribute most of my success to is that I've stayed at it for 63 years. No matter how many times I failed, it's unavoidable that you're going to succeed sometimes. And the lessons from the failures and the successes themselves, they just add up, and you look back and you'll have accomplished a lot.
Well, that is wonderfully inspirational and definitely commencement speech worthy. But thank you for sharing that. And I think, Rich, one of the things that really strikes me about you, it is not just the achievement on the financial side. It's the videos of the jiu-jitsu competitions that your team kindly sent to me, because that's the truly unusual part. I think having that passion that you admit only was in the last 20 years you developed, that is an inspiration. And then some of the learnings from that are what I will take away most. The tapping out, the freedom to tap out over and over again and learn from it. And also the importance of being in that streak of continuous learning. So thank you so much for coming here and sharing that passion with us.
Thanks for having me, Ethan. It was a pleasure.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organizations and affiliations of the host or any guest.